difficulties ahead. Churchill left to brief the senior colleagues most aware of his mix of genius and egotism. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith was still sitting in grave silence, together with David Lloyd George, when the First Lord crashed noisily in. The Chancellor noted with disquiet that Churchill seemed a really happy man.
In some ways, he is the Churchill of the Second World War and even after. He's just a very young, rather green version of that Churchill. He's just quite immature politically, and he's going to learn some very interesting lessons. The First World War will destroy the world that he grew up in. It will destroy the social order that he's familiar with. It will destroy the kinds of ambitions that he might have had.
Yet Churchill was more than a death or glory hussar. He was a sophisticated thinker on the science of war.
Although Churchill had taken part in the last cavalry charge of the British Army at Omdurman, although he was a Victorian figure, he was a very modern military thinker. He understood the importance of exploring, of exploiting science, technology. He saw that the wars were going to be won by a combination of arms, maneuver on land, sea power, and air power.
This passion for military technology had seen both the Navy and Churchill himself take to the skies.
At the turn of the 20th century, the Royal Navy is the world's leading technological fighting force. It masters all of the new technologies. When the airplane comes along, the Navy very quickly works out this is going to be an asset. It's going to allow you to scout. It's going to allow you to fly over the land from the sea. Churchill himself is a great enthusiast for aviation, but it turns out a very poor pilot. He manages to crash, and he's persuaded not to try to learn ever again, so other people do the flying. But Churchill can see the potential, and he's prepared to back the junior officers who have these enthusiasms.
His airmen gave the First Lord a ticket to the land war in France. In September, the Navy won responsibility for the aerial defense of Britain against Zeppelin airships.
Churchill's obviously wanting to get more involved in the land battle. That's where the action is. He's got the excuse of sending over the Royal Naval Air Service, and they're actually sent out across to Dunkirk, where they have the excuse to be there because the Royal Naval Air Service, the planes can go and bomb the German Zeppelins, which might bomb our ships. There's a reason for doing it.
That autumn, Navy pilots launched the first ever bombing raids on Germany, targeting Zeppelin airsheds in Düsseldorf and Cologne. The Dunkirk Circus also allowed Churchill to deploy another mechanized unit, the dashing squadron of naval armored cars.
He's getting reports back that actually with this war of movement that's still going on, we need some armored cars to protect our Air Force base, and they go on sort of almost like buccaneering patrols to try and bump into the enemy and to try and shoot up some German columns advancing, etc. So they have machine guns fitted. He sees the value of a mobile armoured vehicle.
Yet as the dueling armies raced westward, it was the First Lord himself who now made a highly controversial intervention. The Belgian city of Antwerp was under siege. A protective chain of forts ringed a port commanding a key position on the Allied left flank. Yet German howitzers were smashing these redoubts one by one.
If Antwerp held, the German advance in the north would stall. The Germans would simply not be able to get into northern France, and their whole campaign would fail at that point. Churchill instinctively puts his finger on the spot, and he says, we must do something about this.
On October the 3rd, Churchill arrived in Fortress Antwerp on an urgent fact-finding mission. The Belgians were poised to surrender, leaving open the road to the Channel ports. Alarmed, Churchill called for a defiant last stand. And he would stay on to lead their resistance. The First Lord would not fight alone. He summoned Marines and his private army, the Royal Naval Division.
He's actually involved in sending troops from Dunkirk up to Antwerp, again to help reinforce the Belgians, and he uses buses to do this. He actually commissions 100 buses from London. They're driven down to the coast, taken across, and he does this very quickly. That's the other thing about Churchill. He gets things to happen relatively quickly for the First World War.
Consisting of fresh-faced volunteers and surplus sailors, this brand new infantry force was neither trained nor equipped. But they were rushed to the front line. Here, journalists observed Churchill too, smoking large cigars under a rain of shrapnel. In this supercharged state, the warrior overreached himself.
What happens next, however, is that he rather excitedly sends a telegram back to London saying that he wants to, in effect, give up his government post and take command of the British forces there. Oh, and by the way, can he be a general? And the very idea of General Churchill carrying out this role in Antwerp just provokes laughter among his colleagues. And I suspect they're laughing at him, not laughing with him.
On October the 10th, Antwerp finally capitulated. 6 days had been won. But there was a price to pay. Over 1,000 of his new soldiers were left stranded. Fleeing into neutral Holland, they were interned for the rest of the war. Some hailed him a hero, but a hostile press branded Churchill a reckless adventurer and his Antwerp mission a blunder.
Churchill's neither a hero nor a buffoon over Antwerp. It was a sensible idea, and actually it probably did make a bit of a difference. But Churchill has a very unfortunate habit of making himself look foolish as a result, and he does look foolish in the eyes of his peers.
Churchill was an egomaniac, there's no doubt about it. He possessed in someone who was brilliant, insightful and energetic, but at the same time, sometimes reckless and quite often blind to the mistakes that he was making until it was too late to do anything about them.
His brother, Major Jack Churchill, was there, and his accounts of heroism and sacrifice fueled Churchill's frustration.
Churchill could see the disaster unfolding before his eyes. The men who'd been appointed to command the Dardanelles operation were a series of incompetents at best, or men who
Tragic events in the Mediterranean were not the immediate cause of Churchill's downfall. The man responsible was a close friend and father figure inside the Admiralty, Lord Jackie Fisher. This 74-year-old naval legend had been brought back from retirement to lead the Navy in October 1914. The two men were kindred spirits. But Navy insiders like Admiral Beatty foresaw a messy clash of egos.
One old, wily, and of vast experience. One young, self-assertive, with a great self-satisfaction, but unstable. They cannot work together. They cannot both run the show.
These are two men who are simply at opposite ends of every spectrum. Churchill is a young, dynamic politician who wants to run the Navy like an admiral. And Fisher is an elderly, astute, and very experienced admiral who wants to run the Navy like a politician. And both of them actually wanted each other's job.
By April 1915, Fisher had cold feet about both the Dardanelles operation and an interfering autocratic First Lord. Tensions evident in letters held in Churchill College, Cambridge.
What we have here is a wonderful exchange of letters, which I think captures the deteriorating relationship between Admiral Fisher and Winston Churchill. Here you can see that Fisher has written, "Damn the Dardanelles, they'll be our grave." And at the bottom he signs off, "Procrastinations, vacillations, Antwerps." How did Churchill respond on receiving letters like this? Well, I think you can see his gut reaction here in this handwritten note, which he's addressed at the top to the First Sea Lord, 8th of April 1915. Quoting Napoleon, "We are defeated at sea because our admirals have learned, where I know not, that war can be made without running risks."
On May the 15th, Lord Fisher went missing from the Admiralty.
Fisher ultimately has had enough, and he resigns and writes a big resignation letter in which he demands that they get rid of Churchill, that he be allowed to essentially run the Navy. And he sets out a huge kind of list of, "You must do exactly as I tell you because I'm the only man who can win the war."
That weekend, the Churchills journeyed to Asquith's Thameside home to plead for his job. But the game was up. Within days, Asquith would agree to lead a coalition. After the 4 years they called a golden age, the Churchills would leave Admiralty House. He was sacked. Clementine leapt fiercely to her husband's defence.
My dear Mr. Asquith, if you throw...
As it happens, it's Margot who really takes issue with her. She calls Clementine a fishwife. She describes her as having the soul of a servant. But no, she does not have the soul of a servant. She's fighting for her man.
Obsessed with the Dardanelles, Churchill accepted a lowly government post, hoping in vain to influence policy. Privately, he expressed shock and despair.
"I am the victim of a political intrigue. I am finished in respect of all I care for, the waging of war, the defeat of the Germans."
The memory of his famous father Randolph's own political downfall now weighed heavily.
Now that, of course, made the fall that Winston himself suffered in the wake of the Dardanelles disaster all the more awful and all the more bitter. It was very difficult for him to see the way back, and he felt that not only had he failed, but he'd confirmed everyone's view of the Churchills, that they were bound to fail. First Randolph and then Winston. It was like a family curse. And Churchill thrashed around in desperation, wondering how could he find a way back.
The Churchills retired to Hoe Farm, a weekend retreat to lick their wounds. Clementine recognized that her husband was battling with dark inner demons.
People tend to talk about Churchill's black dog. He's gone from being at the centre to being a sort of mere observer of events. And I think it's that he finds incredibly difficult. I think it does hit him like a hammer blow. But another great Churchillian trait is his capacity to recover from these seemingly sort of knockout blows. And it's interesting to look at how he does that and the strategies he uses. You can see him looking around at ways in which to fill the void that has been created in his life. And one of the things that he seeks solace in is painting.
Churchill came across painting as a form of enjoyment, relaxation, and almost therapy. One of his very first paintings is the farm itself, Hoe Farm. Churchill often painted himself into his paintings later, but there's one right near the beginning of his career that he actually painted during the First World War. And it's a very intense, full sort of frontal look at himself, and it's very dark and very unusual because the rest of his paintings are almost entirely colourful sunshine scenes. But this is a really psychological sketch of himself at a time when he was obviously feeling very wretched.
That summer, contemplating a visit to the war zone, Churchill wrote Clementine an intimate letter, to be opened in the event of his death.
Do not grieve for me too much. I am a spirit confident in my rights. Death is only an incident and not the most important one which happens to us. On the whole, and especially since I met you, my darling one, I have been happy. If there is another place, I shall be on the lookout for you. In the meantime, look forward, feel free, rejoice in life, cherish the children, and guard my memory.
1,000 dead. The campaign's loudest champion was publicly denigrated as the man solely responsible.
The disappointment that he felt when it failed was more than his chance for glory in the First World War had passed him by.
For decades, Churchill would be taunted by the cry, "Remember the Dardanelles." Clementine feared that he would die of grief.
This is a man who has been at the centre of government for close on a decade by this stage, and suddenly to be put...
First letters were raw with the anguish felt by every soldier's wife.
My darling Winston, I long for news of you. Although it's only a few miles, you seem to me as far away as the stars, lost among a million khaki figures. Write to me, Winston. I want a letter from you badly.
Both would write, almost daily, and their passionate correspondence sustained them through his perilous days on the Western Front. The 18th century corridors of power. Yet Clementine was a very different wife, finding it noble and romantic that her husband was serving as a mid-ranking officer.
The Daily Mail rings me up and asks if I have had any news from Major Churchill. Major Churchill has a strange sound, but I am prouder of this title than of any other.
Churchill, the politician, the outsider, the peripatetic adventurer, to embrace the First World War than with the 2nd Battalion Grenadier Guards. The Guards' reputation is for ruthless discipline, professionalism, attention to detail. Not only was this a guy, a politician, an outsider, coming to a close-knit regiment of professional soldiers, but he's also everything that culturally they would have been suspicious of. He's ambitious, he doesn't take well to authority. The officers in the Guards Battalion, one suspects, would have been very, very suspicious and hostile to him. Colonel Jeffreys, battalion commander, who's already got a fearsome reputation, even for a commander of a Guards battalion. And I think he says something wonderfully cold on their first meeting, like, just so you know, we didn't ask to have you sent here.
Arriving with excess kit, the newcomer was put firmly in his place. A batman delivered the revised allocation to his dugout, a pair of socks and a shaving kit. Clementine was unconvinced, fearing he would lose newly won respect if he became a chateau general so quickly.
What she knows and understands in a way that he just doesn't quite appreciate is that at home, that would be seen as just going too far too quickly. He's already got a reputation for being a little bit too ambitious, a little bit too egotistical. He is more important than anybody else. She knows that if he were to accept that promotion, it would be negative.
That December, Churchill was on tenterhooks, awaiting confirmation of his rank whilst flitting between the trenches and Allied HQ. His first trench experiences encouraged Churchill to pen a memorandum brimming with new tactical ideas, including a vision of a mass attack of his land ships.
Variants of the offensive. 1. Attack by armor. The cutting of the enemy's wire and the general domination of his firing line can be effected by engines of this character. None should be used until all can be used at once. Above all, surprise.
But no one was listening to a yesterday's man. Churchill now faced a searching test of character, the command of men in battle. Plug Street, on the southern part of the Ypres salient.
This was a time, early 1916, on a front, Plug Street, which was not an active one. He did not command in a major battle. This was trench holding. That was nasty enough, that was dangerous enough, but it's a very different thing than leading men over the top,
if you will. And that's what makes him a very good commander in the First World War. It's almost as though in the trenches, surrounded with the responsibility, and it must be a huge responsibility for a battalion of men, the proximity of death, the fact that your horizons have really narrowed. He's forgotten his political ambitions. For once, he doesn't have half an eye on Westminster, even if it's only briefly. And what comes out is this very impressive Churchill.
He was a decidedly eccentric commander. There are stories of him, for example, going out into no man's land on a patrol, making all sorts of noise and doing so, laying on his electric torch and thus switching it on and basically giving a real target for the enemy. But there's no doubt at all that Churchill, I think, proved to be a very effective battalion commander.
The Western Front offered a diversion from ugly political intrigues. But Churchill still needed his sapient cat to be his eyes and ears in Westminster.
Don't neglect these matters. I have no one but you to act for me. Keep in touch with the government. Show complete confidence in our fortunes. Hold your head very high.
When you look at the role that Clementine Churchill is playing during this period, she really is acting as an anchor. She is listening out for how he is being perceived in the newspapers, but also amongst her contemporaries and also in high political circles. She's guarding his reputation very carefully. She's alerting him to potential dangers, to things that she thinks that he has missed. And she is, of course, also prepared to take up the cudgel and absolutely to defend his reputation.
My darling, today I lunched with Lloyd George. Now don't scold your cat too much for being a hermit. Here, in 2 days, I have hobnobbed with Montague, Birrell, Lloyd George, and a South African potentate. Please send me home the Distinguished Conduct Medal at once, and much praise.
Clementine had volunteered to help the YMCA organize workers' canteens in some of the new munitions factories set up to meet the voracious demand for shells.
She's involved in, I think, about 9, some of which have 500 people to feed. She has to open them, she has to visit them. She talks a lot about the difficulties in getting there, the trains. All this is going on whilst he is asking her to basically be Winston Churchill at home.
The munitions minister was David Lloyd George, the one dynamic star in a lackluster coalition. Clementine was well placed to monitor his steady rise. But a disorientated Churchill did not listen. Granted 10 days home leave in early March, his next political humiliation was to be self-inflicted. The former First Lord was expected at the National Liberal Club to unveil a new portrait of himself. But he never showed up. He'd fallen in with a group of fellow dissidents, eager to plot the downfall of Asquith.
There's no glory to be won on the Western Front. It's a miserable, dirty business, hiding in a trench with a French tin hat on. He can't restore his reputation by fighting. And eventually he comes back to London. And there, almost miraculously, he rebuilds his relationship with Jackie Fisher.
Clementine was horrified that her husband was drawn once again to the admiral who had destroyed his career. Fisher took advantage of Churchill's troubled state of mind, with wild talk of destiny and Churchill becoming Prime Minister. On March the 7th, Churchill went to Parliament to make a speech critical of the Admiralty's performance. Its conclusion stunned the House.
I urge the First Lord of the Admiralty, without delay, to fortify himself, to vitalise and animate his Board of Admiralty by recalling Lord Fisher to his post as First Sea Lord.
An astonishing appeal for the return of Fisher was met with derision and scorn. Margot Asquith's waspish verdict reflected a wider belief that Churchill remained impulsive and lacking in statesmanship.
I hope and believe Winston will never be forgiven his yesterday's speeches. He is a hound of the lowest sense of political honour, a fool of the lowest judgment, and contemptible.
A contrite Churchill returned to Plug Street. He had felt keenly the hostility and mistrust his wife had warned of, and acknowledged her. Haig and the generals were committed to a war of attrition by men. Churchill deemed this killing game futile. He believed in attrition by metal and machines. Fortified by this sense of purpose, he resumed political battles at home.
Must have been an enormous challenge for him.
Parliament saw him establish a reputation as a soldier's friend and leading critic of the generals.
When Churchill gets back to London, he's at a loose end. And he's a man of such huge energy that because he doesn't actually have a proper job to do, he's a pretty effective and annoying gadfly. He begins to criticise British High Command and, to some extent, the government.
I do not see how we are...
Newspaper headlines in autumn 1916 announced the baptism of his landships in the Battle of the Somme. But there was no mass attack.
Only 50 tanks are actually used, and they're not actually that successful. Churchill and a number of other people that are enthusiasts for the tank think, what a waste. You've given away the secret, and it was kept as a brilliant secret from the Germans, and you've shown your hand, as it were. They wanted many more to be used in a massive initial tank attack.
He yearned for war direction. And all hopes were invested in the wizard, Lloyd George, who took over at the War Office after the death of Lord Kitchener.
He thought that with Lloyd George in the cabinet, a friend, a colleague in arms, someone who had influence, that his return was imminent. But it was not to be. And he expressed his frustrations in a letter to his brother Jack. Is it not damnable that I should be denied all real scope to serve this country? Great instability prevails, and at any moment a situation favourable to me might come. Meanwhile, Asquith reigns, supine, sodden and supreme. Though my life is full of comfort, pleasure and prosperity, I writhe hourly not to be able to get my teeth effectively into the Bosch. Jack, my dear, I am learning to hate.
By winter, the pressure for a change in leadership was becoming irresistible.
Lloyd George's strengths are that he has now got a reputation as a figure of great energy and dynamism, a man of push and go, to use his own phrase about the kind of people that he wanted in government. Therefore, although many Conservatives continue to distrust him, they certainly saw him as a better alternative than Asquith, who they saw as weak and ineffectual.
On December the 5th, Lloyd George was finally ready to topple Asquith, with the backing of the Conservatives. Churchill's hopes soared that night when, relaxing at a Turkish bath, he was unexpectedly invited to a dinner, attended by Lloyd George himself. But he had badly misread the signals. A mutual friend was given the unhappy task of deflating his dreams.
These are the exact words I used. The new government will be very well disposed towards you. All your friends will be there. He suddenly felt he had been duped, and he blazed into righteous anger. With that, Churchill walked out into the street.
He later described that as the hardest moment of his life. The disparity between his high hopes and the crushing of them. A sensible calculation might well have told him that Lloyd George was not yet politically strong enough to take that risk of bringing him back into the government. Yet his own belief in himself had overcome his more rational judgment.
Yet this latest of so many crushing humiliations since May 1915 was also the last. Developments in the war further loosened the chains of exile.
The Germans take the decision to defeat the British by sinking merchant shipping in the Atlantic, cutting the so-called Atlantic lifeline, seeking to starve Britain to submission. By the spring of 1917, Britain is running out of food, and actually we reach the point in which Britain appears to be in real danger of losing the war at sea, even though they're holding their own at land. And it's against that background that Lloyd George takes the risk in the summer of 1917 of reintroducing Churchill into government.
Lloyd George needed his friend's spirit and imagination at a time of national peril. Ignoring fierce Tory protests, the Prime Minister summoned Clementine had kept her husband closely informed about the women workers now in his charge.
I was very much interested in the girls. They are nearly all quite young, very...
Rapid growth had given the ministry an inefficient, ramshackle structure. Churchill moved quickly to reform it, energizing Britain's war machine, just in time.
One of the things that people tend not to appreciate about Churchill is that while he was this great orator, this great leader, he was also a man of detail. He was capable of absorbing and understanding and manipulating huge amounts of information. It involves him with complex deals about different materials all over the world, and it's the sort of challenge that he clearly relished.
Where we see a maturing politically of Churchill, that up until this point, he was now in his 40s, of course, he was somebody who charged around, acted impulsively, continually rubbed people up the wrong way, interfered in other people's territory, put their backs up. Now, almost for the first time, he calms down a bit and does a straightforward job of work, acts much more as a team player. He actually also shows a little bit of humility.
400 tanks do a dawn attack on ground that hasn't been chewed up by shell fire weeks beforehand. There's a pre-arranged barrage, very short one. The tanks go forward and a 3-mile gap is cut in the German front line, about 3 miles deep as well. This is a fantastic initial advance. It really is one of the great high points of the British Army in 1917, and back at home the church bells are actually rung for such a great victory.
The bells had pealed too soon. There was no victory at Cambrai, yet it greatly influenced Churchill's war plan for 1919.
Churchill is looking at that strategic overview, which is how and when are we significantly going to be able to use the tank.
By March, 75 German divisions were marshalled opposite just 37 British, holding the weakest southernmost part of the line. General Ludendorff aimed to drive a wedge between the British and French, and to annihilate Haig's armies. Momentous days foreshadowing the summer of 1940 would now unfold.
It marks a stage in Churchill's rehabilitation. Ostensibly, Churchill's role is to act as personal liaison officer between Foch and the British government. In reality, he's there to take the temperature. Are the French army really going to fight? And Churchill gives a wonderful description of this bravura performance, explaining how the battle is going to run down as the Germans run out of impetus, and his chance to seize the initiative will come. Churchill is really inspired by Foch. Here is a man who fights. Here is a man who can be trusted.
Churchill flew out specially to a battlefield still littered with German dead.
My darling, the tracks of tanks were everywhere apparent. On our way to the battlefield, we passed nearly 5,000 German prisoners. Our cavalry are still out in front, and in some parts of the line, there are, at the moment, no Germans left. I am so glad about this great and fine victory of the British Army. There is no doubt that they have felt themselves abundantly supplied.
The British Army puts in some tremendous counterattacks.